cultural preference for trees and woodlands and forests as places that are both beautiful but also have value are inscribed right in the names of the streets in the towns up and down the Flint Hills. Every town has an Elm Street and a Maple Street and an Oak Street. Almost none of them will have a Blue Stem Street or Switchgrass Street or even names for wildflowers. It's just never made its way into kind of the cultural consciousness that it was a place that could be beautiful and valuable in its own right. My name is Tim Schuler. I'm a writer and editor. My work focuses largely on place, on the built and natural environments. I had gone back to Kansas, where I'm from, for a magazine story about the reintroduction of bison to the Tallgrass prairie in Illinois. We were doing a story on the reintroduction of bison to the Nechusa Grasslands Preserve, which is a nature conservancy property up there. And for the story, I went back to Kansas because the Kansas Prairie Biological Preserve has a herd of bison and has been doing kind of some of the most long-term and kind of groundbreaking work on interactions between grazers, prescribed fire, and prairie growth. And so I wanted to understand those interactions as best I could. Even though the magazine story wasn't about Kansas, it was kind of my first time since leaving that I had seen it in a new way, and I became very, very interested. So I developed an essay idea, a story pitch. The article is titled "The Middle of Everywhere." What has happened here is so inextricably tied to all of these other much larger forces, the impact of the railroad and the philosophy of manifest destiny and westward expansion, and the way that land was privatized as the country expanded. It was a kind of tiny microcosm for things that so many people are thinking about right now: public and private, urban and rural, and the future of the Main Street and small town America and blue and red states. There was so much happening that it really did, it felt to me kind of like the middle of everywhere. We like to imagine that people in rural America just aren't thinking about the same kinds of problems that people on the coasts are. Complex issues of land use and climate change and things like that. And in my experience, everyone in the Flint Hills is thinking about the same things. I think the middle of everywhere resonated with me for that reason. And not to mention just the ways in which it does push back against the fact that the middle of nowhere has long been the phrase that's most used when we talk about places like Kansas. So I wanted to push back against that idea and show that this place is so intimately connected to the rest of the country, historically and even in present day. So the history of how the Flint Hills came to be the kind of last largest remnant of tallgrass prairie in the country does owe that to both its geology, but also the human history of the place. The landscape when you go are these rolling hills covered in grass, almost no trees. Not only is the soil shallow on top of these landforms, which made it very difficult to plow or cultivate, but the limestone itself is also embedded with these lines of chert rock, which was mistaken a long time ago for Flint, which is how they got their name, but it's actually a misnomer from the very earliest expeditions by colonizing explorers. It was this part of Kansas was noted for being rough and hard going. And so that geology really is one of the main reasons that the Flint Hills have persisted. The second reason is that ranchers, beginning in about the 1860s, with the arrival of the railroads and a market that could get cattle to places like Chicago, it became very, very desirable grazing lands. A third reason that the Flint Hills looks the way that it does still today and isn't, a woodland is largely due to the presence of fire. Initially, prior to human presence, fires would have been set simply by lightning. But later, it's been documented somewhat that a lot of the native indigenous peoples would use prescribed fire in ways to attract various wildlife, bison, but also elk and antelope. They've done studies to show that really does translate to healthier, more nutritious grass, which obviously translates to healthier, fatter cattle, which of course is the goal if you're a rancher. Early ranchers and settlers would have observed people like the Kanza, now the Kaw Nation, setting these fires. And in the late 19th century, early 20th century, prairie burns, prescribed fire became folk practice of the Flint Hills ranchers. We had some native prairie on the farm where I grew up, a little patch of prairie that our horse would graze. And every year, or about every year, my dad and my mom and my brother and I would go out and we would burn it. And it was one of the most fun days, honestly, of the year. The elusiveness of the tallgrass prairie and the Flint Hills specifically was something I knew I would have to grapple with. The kind of European mentality and worldview and understanding of what constituted a place that could be cultivated and could be tamed. It really limited the way that those early settlers and explorers understood the prairie. It really left the plains very, very sparsely populated because it was seen as so undesirable and so inhospitable. They thought clearly nothing can grow here, when in fact, prairie soils are among the most rich and the most life-giving that we have on the planet. They were not seen as places of value. They are pastures for grazing rather than ecosystems in their own right. Visually, a lot of that does come from not only this inherited idea of aesthetics and of sublime landscapes that we inherited from early writers and painters, but that also I think does emanate from the properties of the prairie itself in the Flint Hills, looking at it and looking for it. Trying to kind of attune your senses to it. There is this elusive quality that I think just has troubled thinkers and artists and writers for a very long time. It's a place that does challenge our aesthetic senses, I think, in large part due to just how expansive it is, how few landmarks there are. Distance can be very deceiving. In terms of trying to kind of capture it in the American imagination and to kind of specifically raise awareness about the plight of the tallgrass prairie, one of the people who's had outsized influence is William Least Heath Moon. In writing this kind of tome that grapples with so much about American life, it put the Flint Hills on the map for artists and writers and designers and photographers. Matfield Green is such an interesting example right now of a place that really has attracted creatives of all types and is kind of only continuing to grow. There are already a number of art galleries and artist residencies. Artists and painters and photographers did start making pilgrimages to the Flint Hills beginning in about the 1970s up through today, and it really has become kind of a locus of artistic interests and talent, that its elusiveness is kind of inherently attractive to the artist. And Patricia Duncan was among the first. She was commissioned by the Smithsonian to come out and put together an exhibition that was all about the tallgrass prairie in the Flint Hills. In the 1990s, Terry Evans came and she made portraits of every single resident who called Matfield Green home at the time that she was living there. She had a way of seeing the place that just felt very generous to me, even though her work also is exploring these really complex issues of land use and environmental degradation. I think of her landscape photography and those portraits as being kind of in dialogue with one another and trying to see the place for what it was, not only this aesthetic landscape, but also a place that real people lived and worked. Erin Wiersma's work is so evocative because she goes out and actually drags these enormous pieces of heavy paper across the recently burned prairie to produce works that essentially look like charcoal drawing, and it's the burned prairie itself that is actually making the marks. And so it feels like you're looking at a prairie scene to me, even though there's no kind of representational aspect to them at all. There is something in the work that just, to me, does communicate growth and renewal and complexity and life and just kind of the mess that is a prairie. It's just such a clear example of someone helping see the Flint Hills in a new way. That's what all of this kind of artistic presence does, is that it just not only helps us see the landscape, it helps us understand our relationship to it and hopefully kind of calls for new ways of inhabiting it too. Kansas State University, the architecture school there, has had a design build studio for a number of years now that has been really focused on the Flint Hills. David and the design build studio, they've really been trying to combat that ignorance about the prairie and the ecosystem and its importance by bringing students out to do studio work in the landscape. They designed and built this really kind of amazing outdoor education station. As objects in the landscape, they're really evocative, and it's something that I found really powerful because of the inscrutability of the prairie. I think you need these opportunities to actually get out in it, but then something to also kind of constrain or frame your experience that kind of provide some sense of direction, to actually put you in a place and say, stand here, observe what you're seeing. You kind of need those anchors when you're in a place that expansive. It's really cool to see students, architecture students, design students, grappling with the Flint Hills and actually exploring that through the lens of design. One thing I always think about is just how much the story of the Flint Hills really does come down to the stories we tell about it. And the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve is so exemplary of the central conflicts in so many of those stories. The history of the preserve goes back to the 19th century when there was an early recognition that the prairie landscape was special and important and could easily be lost. In the 1930s, biologists really were learning more and more about the tallgrass prairie as an ecosystem. Then in the 1950s and 60s, efforts emerged to find a site that could become a national prairie park of some kind. It took all the way up until the 1990s for the preserve to gain any traction. And over the course of those 30 years, there was just a huge amount of distrust among private landowners and ranchers and local residents who worried that the federal government would continue to acquire land. When we were talking about prescribed burns, early on, the county extension officers and researchers working at the university, they thought there was no scientific underpinning for prescribed burns as a practice. And it was at the time the local ranchers who had just seen its efficacy who pushed back and essentially refused to stop, went against the conventional wisdom at the time. And eventually the science came around, and now it's, prairie burning is understood as scientifically sound and ecologically important. It was definitely this sentiment of distrust and kind of skepticism around what the federal government's intentions were. But I also think there was a lot of good intent on park proponents' part in terms of coming with the latest science about how to manage a place and really being concerned with just how much of the Flint Hills was privately owned. Ranchers on one hand, environmentalists on the other. It was far more messy than that, but these two groups squared off for years and years and years. It took until the 90s for that to happen, and the site that was selected was an old ranch that was about 10,000 acres. First of all, the site that was selected was far smaller than many of the proposals had called for, but also the preserve would be a preserve and not a national park, which meant that grazing could continue on the land. On the one hand, it was this triumph to finally, after 3 or 4 decades, protecting a piece of the tallgrass prairie and specifically the Flint Hills from future development and opening it to the public. But in other ways, the final design and kind of management scheme for the property really did represent the death of any kind of truly public vision for the Flint Hills because private interests had won out so heavily. Narrative has played such a huge role in Kansas as a whole, but especially the Flint Hills. You drive down the roads and there are these weathered steel cutouts of cowboys on horseback, roping cattle, or just these depictions of this very kind of mythologized moment in history that reinforces this narrative, and disrupting that narrative, I think, is really important, not to mention the absence of any kind of mention of indigenous culture and the ways that they were displaced and kind of dispossessed. Combating narratives is one thing, and actually putting practical prescriptions into place is just something else entirely. And what I eventually came down to was the need for new narratives, but also revived public institutions that could bring people together and hopefully heal some of these ideological divides that have divided the community for so long. The ways that these cultural institutions and artistic communities and ranchers, many of whom are interested in the perpetuation of this place, are all kind of swirling around one another and have built what they have up to this point, maybe naively, but there's a future kind of from that line forward that I think we need to try and follow to reach a kind of new understanding and new ways of living together in that place.